Greetings, happy warriors, and welcome to not just the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show, but to the 500th episode of the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show. Isn't that terrific? I mean, I was so excited when my team told me that we are now working on the 500th episode, and this is it. So thank you all very much. Thank you for the role you have played in this. Thank you for the role you have played in growing it and spreading the word and getting more and more like-minded people to find value and benefit in the show, and I appreciate all of that. So I welcome you, Happy Warrior, to the 500th episode of the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show, the show where I dedicate myself solemnly to revealing how the world really works. And one of the things that we are going to look at today, the title of the show is It's Hard to Make a Living, but It Doesn't Have to Be. And so that is the overall theme, right? The idea that knowing what to do and how to do it is very, very important, because it's so easy to make the mistake of thinking that being busy means you are making progress, right? You've got some way of keeping a track of your 5 F's. Maybe you use a notebook like I do with 5 tabs: family, faith, finances, friendship, and fitness. And once a week, I review and I see where I stand in these things. And not surprisingly, very often, I look and gosh, this week I've really been neglecting the faith angle a little bit. Or this week I've been very focused on family and friendships. It's been a time of a lot of socializing, so I've been neglecting the finance side. And that helps me reset course for the next week. And so what we choose to do has to always address whether it advances us and makes us progress in the right direction. Very easy to find things to be busy with. It's even easier to find things to entertain us and amuse us and distract us. People often ask me, is there no F for fun? And I think it should be self-evident to every good, happy warrior as to just why we're not so concerned about an F for fun. We've got 5 F's. They are the fundamental 5 pillars of our lives, and we need to make progress in all of those things. Making a living is very tied to keeping all of those things in sync. You might think that making a living is advanced only by focusing on finance, and leave friendships and building a family and faith. Leave those things till after you've made a few dollars. If you've read The Holistic You already, then you understand why that's not a good strategy. If you haven't, then I'm going to ask that you do just that. The Holistic You. It's our newest book, and in many ways the most important. Yes, Thou Shalt Prosper, very important. Business Secrets from the Bible, very important. Buried Treasure. I wonder if you've read that one. There's a special now on our website on buried treasure. But a key, there are always a few exceptions, right? I've told you how I once had the great fun of being invited to lunch with a few people at the Hillcrest Country Club in Los Angeles years ago. And one of the guests around our little table was the actor George Burns, who at this point was, if he wasn't 100, yet he was very close to 100, because he only lived a year or so after this. So, anyway, during the course of our lunch, he smoked 2 cigars. And afterwards, I jokingly said to him that obviously that is the secret to long life, is smoking cigars regularly. and he sort of allowed a twitch of his lips. He wasn't terribly amused. And he said, look, the fact that it's worked for me doesn't mean it's going to work for... Yes, there are always outliers. Are there people who focused exclusively on making money on the finance side and ignored faith, ignored friendship, ignored connecting and building family, ignored even fitness sometimes? And they succeeded? Yeah. But it's a small minority. It's rare for that to happen. Most of us need to work on multiple fronts at the same time, all 5 fronts. We've got to make sure that we're taking care of our physical health. We've got to, very importantly, make sure that we are nurturing and nourishing our friendships, our social life, family. It goes without saying, depending where you are at in your own family formation progress. Do you already have a family? Do you not yet have a family? But obviously it is crucially important. Faith, yeah, because faith doesn't just mean your relationship to God. Faith means your relationship with everything that is non-measurable in a science lab. And that means loyalty and esteem. It means a sense of dignity, a sense of confidence and optimism about the future. All of these things fall under the faith category. But again, if you've read The Holistic You, then you don't need me telling you any of this. You are well on your way. You have a roadmap, and you are already making very good progress. I mentioned buried treasure. Please take a look at our website at www.rabbidaniellapin.com, and you will see there that you can take a good look at our book, Buried Treasure. It would be really very useful to you in many ways. One of the ways people have written to tell me that they're finding use in this book is that it gives important conversational topics, either for your family around the dinner table or with friends and even business associates. It is important in terms of being broadly developed people that we are not unidimensional. I've known, for instance, newly qualified doctors who can talk only about medicine. And, you want to discuss something else. You want to discuss Western civilization, or you want to discuss the car industry, or you want to discuss recycling of plastic and whether that makes any sense in reality. And no, they are still unidimensional. So it's really important in terms of building relationships that you are able to discuss and participate and share ideas from a wide variety. I've told you before, right, that at the lowest level, people talk about people. The next level up is people who talk about things. And the highest level is people who can talk about ideas. So we never want to talk about people. Not even if there's, especially not if they're celebrities. We don't want to talk about things, although sometimes we do. Yeah, so, we might talk about firearms or cars or boats, or I'm just coming up with things that pop into my mind in the area of things. But there's lots. There's an awful lot of things to talk about in the area of things, and it's also important. I told you before that understanding how the world really works very often is helped by interacting with things, because things obey the laws of nature and the laws of physics, and they remind us that there are laws. Not everything is untethered. And even in the world of thoughts and ideas, it is a mistake to suppose that it is completely free to float anywhere without any kind of restraint or limitation. There is such a thing as reality, even in the area of the spiritual or the area of the emotions and the intellect and the brain and the ideas, what falls under the F of faith. So the book Buried Treasure, very useful. Oh, by the way, have you subscribed yet to the podcast, we got to keep those subscription numbers climbing. So go ahead and hit subscribe. I'd love you to do that. And if you are not yet a member of our Happy Warrior community, go ahead and do that. One of the benefits that that attain to Happy Warriors is that not only do you get access to a vast library of resources to be used in the developing of your 5Fs, but also if you become a special access Happy Warrior, then on a regular basis, Susan and I get on a Zoom call with a few of you, and we get to talk quite openly and candidly and privately, and we get to discuss things that I wouldn't necessarily be happy talking about in public. So that is, again, and we got the next one coming up in about 2 weeks' time. So there is time if you go ahead and get yourself joined. You do that at RabbiDanielLapin.com. And if you want to get a bit of an idea of what are the benefits of all the things you get as a member of the Happy Warrior community, you can go to WeHappyWarriors.com. So start off at RabbiDanielLapin.com, and you might check into WeHappyWarriors.com. But not only is it always easier to attain our objectives when we are part of a team, when we're with people who can help us, but we also get an enormous benefit from helping other people on the team. And this is true, obviously, in business as well. One of the most important things for sales managers to learn is how to teach sales professionals that sharing tips and tools and techniques that they pick up with other sales professionals on the team isn't going to cost them anything. It's going to benefit them. It's counterintuitive. And very often, sales professionals become experienced and knowledgeable. They sort of keep their secrets to themselves and try and make sure that nobody knows. It's helping other people, helping others advance is a huge tool in moving ourselves forward as well. So, in order to talk a little bit more about making a living, it's hard to make a living, but it doesn't have to be. Let me explain that if I can show you what it is that made it possible for certain nations to thrive as opposed to many other nations that didn't, what is the difference between nations who succeeded and nations who failed? Why is it that every year thousands of people drown in their desperate attempts to get from North Africa across the Mediterranean in leaky little boats in order to get into Europe? Why aren't there the same number of people? Look at any busy highway. Look at any busy highway, you'll see roughly the same number of people going in each direction. The highway is busy both sides all the time. So why isn't the Mediterranean busy with little boats trying to get from Europe to Africa? Nobody's trying to immigrate to Africa. People are trying to get out of Africa. Why? Well, because there's more money at the moment in Europe. And as I explained in last week's show, that may not necessarily remain the case for long. But for the moment, that is the case. So that only postpones the question, right? Why is it that Europe is more financially successful? Well, if I can show you why Europe is more financially successful and show you that the techniques that made Europe more successful are precisely those that you can and should use in your own life, well, obviously that makes it easier to earn a living. And so that's what we're talking about. We're also trying to address the question of why it is that the forces of progressivism found very often among the elite in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in the United States of America, the ideas they have are always wrong. And although there's every attempt made to try and demonize and portray populists ordinary people as dumb and as not knowing what's in their best interest, we actually have a pretty good idea. And that idea is defending the values that produced the West in the first place. And so what we really are looking at is the difference between what is called the West and the rest. And to start that off, I want to ask that you take a look at Robinson Crusoe. Now, I don't mean for you to go and get the book. It was written in the 1700s, and it's not a particularly easy book to read, but you all know the story, right? Robinson Crusoe gets cast away on this remote, isolated desert island, and he's alone, and survival is very, very difficult. And eventually, a little further down the road, he manages to meet up or find a friend. He makes a friend, and the friend he calls Friday, and the two of them stand a better chance than either of them would have stood isolated and alone. But think for a moment, put yourself in the position of Robinson Crusoe, cast up on the desert island, and you have some really serious problems, right? Immediately, very serious. Water. You need water. You need food. You need shelter. You're going to have to figure out how to make a fire. Let me ask you, during the first few months, how much leisure time do you think that you have on your island? Let me ask you, how often do you think you're able to lie down on the beach in the sun, enjoying a good book that you managed to rescue with you, and just relax, enjoying the sound of the waves? How much of that do you think you're going to be doing? And I think you will see that that's not going to be happening very often at all. Not happening. It's going to be a matter of survival. You know, there's a lot of things on that island that are trying to kill you. And here we come to a basic truth. Contrary to the image that is made popular today, which is, oh, people ruin everything, but if you just leave nature alone, everything is wonderful. Not actually like that. Nature is trying to kill you all the time. I know that sounds harsh, but it's really true. If it's not mosquitoes or viruses or bacteria, I mean, there are all kinds of things that are trying to make you sick and to eventually take your life. There's hunger, there's thirst, there's heat stroke, there are wild animals on this island. There's a lot of attempts to deprive you, never mind of your liberty and your happiness, but your life. So you're pretty busy. There's not a lot of leisure time. It's hard to make a living. Right? Just what I said. Now, we move on after that to it doesn't have to be. But right now, I want you to understand as clearly as possible that extracting a living from an often reluctant earth is very, very difficult. If you're by yourself, you probably aren't going to make it. The more people that you have on your team, the better shot you have. But that brings us already to part of the solution. Right now, let's still just focus, if you don't mind, on the challenge. And so you're going to have to figure out how to hunt. I don't know, maybe there's wild boar on the island, but there are, on hoofs and feet, there are sources of protein, and you need them very badly indeed. And so how are you, have you thought about this? I mean, there you are. How are you going to hunt meat? How are you going to catch fish? There's a fine little lagoon on the other side of the island, and you can see fish there. How are you going to catch them? You know, you don't have a nice $400 Penn fishing reel. You don't have a rod. How are you going to do it? But you'd better figure these things out pretty darn quickly, because nature is trying to kill you. Now, if that is the case, the next thing I would say is, let's imagine that you have your spouse with you. It's now the two of you. Much easier, right? Because killing a wild boar and making a fire and cooking it for two people doesn't take any more effort and energy than doing it for one person. But two people can collaborate. And a very important point that I want you to remember is that the cumulative effect of two people collaborating is huge. It's almost incalculable. See, if you throw a dice, a six-sided dice, it can land in any one of six ways. If you throw two dice at the same time, the result is that there are not 12 options. There are 36 options. Add another dice, and you're not doubling the possibilities, you're multiplying them. You know, if one person brainstorming by himself can come up with 3 solutions to a problem, two people working together on the problem won't come up with 6 solutions. They'll come up with 15 solutions. So you cannot overestimate the impact of communication, connection, collaboration, cooperation. The result is creation on a huge plane. So it's worth realizing that. And but still, you know, even if you're there with your spouse, you're still not going to have a lot of spare time. Mere survival is going to take up pretty much all the time you have. And if you think of peasants all the way through the Middle Ages and later, peasants in Eastern Europe, peasants in Asia, no spare time. They work very hard all the time just to survive because nature's trying to kill them all the time. Included in that, of course, is the fact that you need food in order to survive. And nature doesn't provide food for free. And so it takes a lot of energy and a lot of effort. And through the process of metabolism, you want to hope that the energy it takes in order to get a fire and to get food and to get water is not more than the energy produced by the result of what you achieve. So we find that if you look, for instance, let's say the early 20th century, you know, say 1900, the beginning of the 20th century, large parts of the Earth's surface are still populated by people who are working non-stop. There's no 7 or 8 hour day. There's no 2-day weekend. These people are working 10 or 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. People in Africa, people in Asia, parts of South America, in order to survive. That's what it's taking. But at exactly the same time, in London and in Chicago and in Barcelona and in Cologne and Hamburg and Copenhagen and all kinds of westernized cities, there are people who are working 7 hours, 8 hour days, sometimes less, and they're taking 2-day weekends. They seem to have got living down right. What is more, if you look at these people who are struggling in the year 1900 in parts of Asia and South America and Africa, not only are they struggling very hard in order to stay alive, but the odds of their dying through violence are very high compared to the man in London who goes and sits behind his desk in an office in the city He gets there at 10 in the morning, and he leaves at 4 in the afternoon. Or in New York, man catches the Long Island Railway from his home out in the suburbs of Long Island, and he rides the Long Island Railway into the city, and he gets a cab, takes him from might have been a horse-drawn cab, takes him from the station to his office, and he puts in, a good 5, 6, 7 hours work, and then he goes home, and 2 days a week he doesn't go to the office. What are his chances of dying by violence? In the year 1900, in the streets of London or Chicago or New York, very low. And, unless he's involved in the underbelly of society, he's involved in crime. But no, normal, law-abiding people have a very good shot of dying of old age. Not so in those parts of the world where people are really struggling. So not only is nature trying to kill them, but very often other people are trying to kill them. And death by violence is very common. South America, throughout Africa, throughout parts of Asia. But very seldom does it happen on the streets of Rome. It's very unusual for it to happen on the streets of Denmark or the streets of Manchester. Doesn't happen. So what is the difference? I mean, everybody who is born in that part of the world should be on his knees every day, thanking the Lord for having him born there rather than in a village 50 miles from Calcutta. Big difference. But what is the difference? How does that work, and why is that? Well, how about wrapping yourself around this question? It was about 15. When was it? 1520. It was 1520 when a Spaniard named Hernando Cortez sailed to Mexico with only about 600 soldiers, conquistadores. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that right. And a few horses, I don't know, 50 horses or something came with them. And they landed on the beaches of Mexico, where the dominant culture was the Aztec culture. And the Aztec culture, they had cities. Their main city, which is where Mexico City is now, was actually in the middle of a lake, which has subsequently been reclaimed and drained, and it's all Mexico City. But back then, the capital city, starting with a T, and I can't pronounce the name, was located on an island in the middle of the lake, and they had causeways, fairly sophisticated. But at the same time, they were doing live sacrifices of people. They were killing. Huge mounds of skulls have been found by archaeologists studying the Aztecs. And there's not much of Aztec culture left. You know why? Because Hernando Cortez wiped them out. How many did he kill? Somewhere between 500,000 at the low end to about 3.5 million. And most historians think it's towards the higher end. So 600 Spaniards wipe out perhaps a couple of million Aztecs and carry gold and silver in vast quantities back to Spain. Why is it that throughout the 1400s, how come no Aztecs sailed across the Atlantic and beached their boats in Barcelona and set about taking over Spain? They never even tried. Why did that not happen? Why? It's a good question. And we can continue that question because Mexico soon belonged to Spain. But Spain never belonged to the Aztecs. In the 18th century, oh, wait a second, before then, England, Germany, Italy, France, Portugal are busy going to Africa. And so the east part of Africa was colonized by Germany and the Portuguese. Southwest Africa, Namibia, colonized by the Germans. Part of Central Africa colonized by the Belgians. The French took a large part of North Africa. The British took parts of West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, many other places, South Africa, as well as East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, all of that taken by the English. So why is it that no African ever took ships, crossed the Atlantic, and or sailed up the Atlantic rather, sailed to England, beached their boats in Devon, and set up a colony in Sussex? Why? Never happened. Why did no Namibians sail up the west coast of Africa just the way the Germans sailed down the west coast of Africa? Why didn't any Namibians sail up the River Rhine and colonize Hamburg? Never happened. Why did no Indonesians sail to Amsterdam and set up colonies on the shores of the North Sea? Never happened. The Dutch did set up a trading post at the southern tip of the African continent in the 17th century. They called it Cape Town. A little later, the British took it away from the Dutch, and much of Africa was colonized. Today, Africa is still colonized, but this time in a different way by the Chinese. But that was last week's podcast. We discussed that then. But for now, the question is, what is the difference? Why is it that Holland and England and Portugal and Germany and France and Italy, Libya was colonized by Italy. Why did all these countries have colonies? But nobody in South America came to colonize Europe. Nobody in South Asia came to colonize Europe. Nobody in Africa came to colonize Europe. Now, you could say, well, they were all just nicer people because it's popular today to decry colonialism as an unmitigated evil. Obviously, like all oversimplistic answers, that is true, is also false. But it's pretty obvious that if there was a way to make living easier, if there was a way to live better with less work, they would have wanted to do it. That's exactly why the European countries I mentioned did go. The Dutch East Indies. The Dutch acquired much in the way of land in the forest. They wanted rubber, they wanted oil, many, many things. As I said, the Italians and the French and the Germans and the British came to Africa. The Portuguese, Portuguese East Africa, Mozambique, all Portugal. The Portuguese also went towards India and the Indian Ocean. So there, all these countries are finding ways to make it easier for them to defeat nature and live more comfortably with less effort. Isn't that what everybody is trying to do then, now, tomorrow, all the time? Sure. So what is going on here? Why is it? What do you say to that? Why is it that stable governmental institutions, reliable justice systems, property protection systems, why did these systems not take root anywhere else other than the countries I've been talking about? In South America, in most of Africa, you couldn't buy and take title of a piece of land. The whole thing didn't exist. In the same way that when the Pilgrims in the 1620s in the northeast United States, wasn't the United States yet, North America, when they tried to buy land from the native American Indians, it made no sense. They had no idea what it was talking about. And the conversation between the Pilgrims and the native Indians, where the Pilgrims said, we want to buy this land, this very much resembles a discussion in Genesis in the Bible, worth looking at, in which Abraham is trying to buy land to bury his wife Sarah, who had just died. And he found a cave, and he liked the cave. And today you can still visit this cave. It's in the town of Hebron, outside Jerusalem. You can go there. And even for many, many years, the Muslims also took care of this cave because it was known to be the birthplace of Abraham. And so the conversation recorded in the book of Genesis is really interesting, because what happens is that Abraham says to them, I want to buy this field from you. And it's evident from the dialogue that the locals had no idea what he was talking about. Not a clue. And so it's exactly what it was like in the year 1900, trying to buy land in some of these countries. It was you were speaking a language that nobody understood. But from way before that already, if you wanted to buy land in Italy or in Sweden or in Norway or in Germany or in Holland, no problem. Something is going on here, and we need to try and understand, because the ability to acquire property and to take title to property, this is obviously part of it. And the idea that legitimate business disagreements can be resolved by means of a judicial system, this is all really important. And these institutions did not show up everywhere around the world at the same time. How about the idea of the corporation? It's an incredible concept, isn't it? It's a remarkable thing that you can take a virtual entity, and it lives longer than the life of a human being, and it can transact business. It can own property. What an amazing concept. And so obviously the development of the corporation as it emerged in Amsterdam and in London, that concept was hugely important. But why did nobody think of the concept of the corporation in South America or in Africa or in Asia? Never happened. Why is it that the overwhelming majority of the scientific, technological, and medical advances in the 1,000 years from the year 900 to the year 1900, 97% of them happened in these countries I'm talking about? Why? I mean, it's so bizarre. Why? It's certainly important to know. Yes, the Chinese did invent gunpowder, that is true. But what they used it for was basically making pretty pictures in the sky with fireworks. Don't get me wrong, I love fireworks. But nobody thought of using that in a cannon until Europe. Firearms, right? Hugely important. You know, you may wish we lived in a world with no weapons, but that's not a reality. And again, powerful technological weapons, gunpowder-driven weapons. The Gatling gun, 10 barrels rotating and firing rapidly one after a devastating machine of death. But nobody thought of this in India. Nobody thought of it in Africa. Nobody thought of it in South America. What is going on? Well, why is it that these countries, and I've named a whole lot of them, but collectively we tend to think of them as the West. That's not a term you hear a lot these days for various reasons I've thought about. But you know what I mean. When I say Western civilization or the lands of the West, you know which places we're talking about. And so why is it that somewhere round about the year 300, hard to, you can't nail it down to the date, but somewhere around about 300, all of a sudden, Europe starts shooting ahead. And yes, we did have the Dark Ages, but the Dark Ages were not nearly as dark as we like to think of them. It was still a time of very interesting things happening in a way they were not happening in the rest of the world. So something happens that makes Europe start shooting ahead, technologically, economically, militarily, and you can see in the same way that I tell you that your 5Fs are all linked together, your faith, your family, your finances, your fitness, and your friendships, you can't work on only one. They are all interconnected and they feed and nurture one another in the same way. You can't say a country should focus on its military and nothing else, because military depends on finance and on the economy. So you've got to develop the economy. But wait a second. For the economy to work, you've got to have people. You've got to have families producing children and educating children. Okay, so now we've got to worry about that as well. You see, all of these things interplay. We human beings do not have the luxury of being able to focus on only one specialized, narrow area of life. In the area of making a living, that's different. You might decide to be a specialist mechanic working only on German cars. You might well do that, but and you'd specialize. But in life, the same German car mechanic is worrying about his business and his children and his wife and his social life and his physical health and his faith. And so it has to be. You cannot succeed in any other way. The book is The Holistic You, because we are holistic organisms. So what happens? Right, you get the idea. It's hard to make a living. It is. Nature's trying to kill you, at least by starvation, if no other, many other ways as well. It's trying to kill you. It's hard to make a living, but it doesn't have to be, because you see, even as late as the 20th century, many, many, many parts of the world, as I told you, were populated by people struggling to survive, engaged in a desperate struggle. But at exactly the same time, the businessman living on Long Island and the London professor who goes and teaches a few courses a week at the University of Oxford or Cambridge, they're living very gracious lives at exactly the same moment. Why? What explains this? Well, if we can answer that, then we can also show you that in your life, making a living doesn't have to be a desperate struggle for survival. But let's delve a little more deeply into what it is that explains why all of these countries we think of as the West seem to allow people to live graciously, comfortably, and safely, while at exactly the same time in most of the other parts of the world, life's not like that at all. What is going on? Well, obviously, I'm not the first person to pose this question. It's an obvious question. And the attempts to answer it have fallen into two main categories. One is racial, which is that the Northern Europeans possessed just innately and genetically high intelligence, strong impulse control. They were not at the whim of their passions, and a sociability and an amiability that allowed them to cooperate and set up institutions. For good reason, that explanation, this racial or biological explanation, has pretty much fallen into disrepute, in spite of the fact that, yes, there are measurable differences, but that doesn't seem to explain it all. And then the second category of explanation for how do you distinguish, how do you explain how these two parts of the world, the West and the rest, how they all developed so completely differently. And this is this set of explanations I think of as environmental. The areas of Europe were places that had rivers, and the weather led people to have to work hard, and etc., etc. Trouble is, it doesn't really hold up, because there are other places that are on the same latitudinal weather band where there were differences. So, for instance, you might look at the white settlers who came to Australia and built up an incredible civilization. What a wonderful country, although they did fail horribly. Not the whole country, but Victoria particularly, with their COVID reactions. But leaving that aside, nonetheless, Australia is a beautiful place. Since when? Well, since the Europeans arrived, since the British set it up as a colony. But what about all the Aborigines who lived there till that time? Why didn't they build a beautiful resort near Bondi Beach in Sydney? What about New Zealand? There were Maoris living there for a long time. Why is it that the skyscrapers of Auckland were not built until English people came there? And you can understand why this question makes people feel a little awkward and uncomfortable, right? Because at the back of their minds, they're thinking, oh, maybe it is the racial explanation. But it isn't. But they don't know it isn't. Because the problem is that government and academia, please hear this well, please. Government and academia tend to only see materialistic explanations for everything. Materialistic or physical, meaning things you can touch and measure. So, for instance, right now, much of the West is suffering from a fertility crisis. Your basic need is 2.1 children per woman. That's what you basically need. And that's not great, but you can survive. A culture can survive with that. America, below 2.1. South Korea is below 1, never mind 2.1 children. Women are having on average less than 1 child. Doesn't mean the kids are half-wit. Means that statistically, when you calculate it out, the country is dying, it's vanishing. Japan, very low. So parts of Europe as well. What do these countries do? They say, well, the reason they're not having children is there must be not enough money. They're worried about having children and not being able to take care of them. Because after all, the most important thing for any woman to do is join the workforce. Far, far better that she has to obey a boss than that she has to be a wife and part of a married couple. And so must be that if we build enough childcare facilities and enough schools and enough help for mothers, that'll bring up the rate of fertility. And it doesn't. It does not work. Because the reason for low fertility has nothing to do with money. In fact, in many parts of the world where fertility is high, poverty is also high. Doesn't seem to make a difference. And so, never mind. Academia, universities, and governments persist the explanation must be material. But you are a happy warrior, and you know that one of the F's is faith, understanding the non-measurable, understanding the spiritual part of life. Confidence and optimism are spiritual. There is no way of measuring them. But you know what it is, and I know what it is. And you know when you're feeling confident and optimistic, and you know when you're not. And you know when somebody you meet is radiating optimism and confidence, or whether he's radiating a sense of defeat and hopelessness. But there's no instrument that you can point at a person's forehead like a remote thermometer and read to see, oh, he's pretty optimistic. There is no such thing. So they don't understand that fertility is tied to optimism and confidence, not to money and childcare. And what is one of the best sources of optimism and confidence? Faith. Yeah, simple as that. That's why it is that Israel is extraordinary. It's the only industrialized country in the world where the fertility rate is over 3. It's extraordinary. But that's because so many people in Israel are religious. And this makes no difference whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam. Religious people have more children. It's pretty clear. So you can't expect the truth from universities, academia, government, United Nations. That's where we look to for truth. I don't think so. So that's not going to happen. And so they look for materialistic reasons to explain why it is that the West seems to produce gracious living, an ability to defeat nature, an ability to live. And defeating nature doesn't mean spoiling nature, right? You can go hiking in the mountains of Switzerland and you're going to be, it's breathtaking. You can go hiking in the fjords of Norway and it's breathtaking. But all these countries have made it possible for people to work 5 days a week or less and live comfortably, fulfillingly, and safely. And that cannot be said, even today, 21st century, for all parts of the world. Something special is going on. Well, what do you expect academia to come up with? Well, another materialistic explanation. And that's, I told you, the racial, biological explanation, genetic, pretty much pushed aside as it ought to be. The environmental explanation, well, that's the one that sort of remains, even though it too ought to be put aside. As I said, it's not as if environment has no role at all. Of course, it's easier with European rivers than African rivers. I explained that last week. Of course. And of course, there are differences among different races of people. But those are not enough to explain this by any means. But nonetheless, the books come pouring off the presses, trying to, ever since, by the way, Adam Smith in 1776 published The Wealth of Nations. And again, trying to come up with an explanation for solving this massive enigma. The lovely historian Neil Ferguson wrote The West and the Rest. And he came up with the fact that the West developed what he called 6 killer apps, such as property rights and judicial systems and so on. But all that does is postpone the question of, well, yeah, okay, fine. But why did those countries develop these killer apps? And so it is. Samuel Huntington wrote a book about this as well, and so many people did this in order to try and explain what it was. Like, what is it that can possibly answer why this is? David Landis, another scholar, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And all of them basically at the end have to say, well, but yeah, this still doesn't do it. I mean, yes, it's true, the West did have guns and they were able to deal with germs, but why? I mean, all you're doing is postponing the question. The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty by James Robinson, and Why Nations Fail by Samuel Huntington. I can list you about 15 books. That is a short bibliography. That's only a portion of the books that have been written, and they all come up. As I say, it's been many, many years. Nobody's been writing lately on the racial explanation. This is now the environmental explanation, and the books don't stop coming. And they almost acknowledge the inadequacy. So we've got to now try and understand what is it that really happened. So if you rule out racial difference, and you say, look, the fact that there are differences in intelligence and impulse control and conscientiousness and amiability, yeah, sure. But Not enough, because those things, they can be acquired. It doesn't explain it. And if you then fall back on the environment, that it all has to do with weather and agricultural conditions and geography and so on and so forth. And as I say, in 15, 20 books that I'm aware of, many of which I've read, all of which make the same case, because they're honest enough to acknowledge that the problem is a huge, big, giant, hulking monster of a problem. You've got to find a way of explaining. So if it's not just environmental factors, and it's not racial factors, what is the secret sauce? What is it that was poured into the European mix starting around about 300? And then there were times where it became stronger and times became weaker. But what was it? And as I said, I'm going to give you the answer in just a moment. But don't waste your time running to your neighborhood university and saying to them, you know what I heard from Rabbi Daniel Lapin? He gave this explanation for why the West achieved what it did while the rest struggled. And because you'll find yourself in an argument, they're going to reject it. You know why? Because it's a spiritual explanation, not a material explanation. Racial and environmental are all material explanations. This one is the truth is a spiritual explanation. So rather than going along and say, oh, what do you guys say? Use your own powers of analysis. This does not require scholarly knowledge. Anything you need you can find in about 2 minutes of research on the web. And then it's up to you to think this through and for you to determine whether I am speaking through my yarmulke or whether I'm telling you how the world really works. You can figure it out for yourself. You need nobody's help. Okay, so in order for me to give you this answer, I have to walk you through one other little thought experiment. We played with Robinson Crusoe. Here's another thought experiment. Some of you happy warriors have heard me talk about this thought experiment before, but here it is. Are you ready? Simple, straightforward. A baby boy and a baby girl get placed on a benign desert island, and we set up clandestine surveillance equipment, cameras and remote, and it's all hidden, and we set it up so we can watch them for centuries. And there's no danger on this island. Everything is safe. Food is there. The weather is good. In other words, I'm stipulating that this little boy and this little girl, unlike Robinson Crusoe, they will survive easily. There's not a problem. Hey, this is a thought experiment. I can set the ground rules any way I like them. And because I'm trying to home in on a particular angle, I'm going to remove all the other problems out of the picture, and we'll just look at this angle. So question number one is, if we come back and check our cameras in 20 years, how many people do you think we're going to find on this island? Would you agree with me? We're going to find at least 3, maybe more. In other words, this little infant boy and this little infant girl, they discovered one another. And they started having babies. Pretty straightforward. Do you think they'll have a language of communication? Sure, they'll figure it out. They'll come. They don't speak English. They don't speak German. They don't speak any language any of us have ever heard of. But because humans are wired for communication, they will develop a language. They just will. And so we know that. I mean, that is not a question. And so we watch, and let's come back in a few hundred years' time. Safe to say that we now have a tribe. Okay, yeah, I don't know exactly how long it takes, but we come back and there's now, shall we say, 200 people, 300, 500 people living on the island, big tribe. This is now a bit of a more difficult question. Do siblings have sex with each other? I'm sorry, I mean, I don't know how to put it more discreetly, but this is really important for us all to get clear. And our initial response is, ugh, gross, how could that be? Of course they wouldn't. But when you think about it, you realize, of course they would. Why wouldn't they? Oh, they'll figure out that their genetic disorder. Since when did long-term considerations make men regulate their sexual behavior? Of course not. And it's not just siblings. I dare say it might even be more problematic areas of incest. In other words, what we think of as a family today wouldn't even exist, because families would be seething cauldrons of sexual intrigue everywhere, all the time. Think about that, because I really want you to be comfortable with this notion that all the areas of sexual restraint and regulation that our Judeo-Christian culture has imposed upon the West is an imposition. It's not natural to human beings. And that these people, this tribe of people on the island, know of no such things. Watch a little longer. Do you think it's possible that the tribe will split into two tribes? Almost inevitable, right? It might be two males will develop a rivalry, and one male will take his guys off and form their own. Or maybe one group wants to establish rights over the spring of the cleanest, freshest water on the mountain on the island, or maybe whatever it is. But I think you can be sure that when we come back and look again a few hundred years later, it's going to be more than one tribe. Now, here's the next question. Do you think relations between the two tribes are going to be warm and affable and harmonious and peaceful and conciliatory and cooperative? Or do you think they will be in a state of almost constant war with one another? And if you said the latter, you're right. And again, this one is not speculation, because from records at the time, in the 19th century, we saw that most tribes in Africa were in a state of constant warfare with one another. And by the way, what did they used to do? When they conquered, when one tribe vanquished another, they enslaved them. And they sold the slaves to Arab traders who sailed up and down the east coast of Africa in big fat sailing boats called dhows. And they sailed one way when the wind was blowing at one time of the year, and they sailed back at the other time of the year when the wind reversed direction. And they carried slaves. Millions and millions of slaves were sold on the east coast by other tribes, other fellow African tribes. And so tribal life tends to be a warlike one. Think of the great Peter O'Toole movie, Lawrence of Arabia. And I was trying to give credit to the wonderful director, and this is really silly because I'm going to remember it as soon as I finish talking with you, I'm sure. David, never mind. But at any rate, if you haven't yet seen Lawrence of Arabia, you should, because you'll see the Arab tribes are at war with one another. Now, if they would have all have combined together, they could have defeated England, they could have defeated France, but they didn't. And so it's not speculative at all to say that these tribes are all at fighting and at war with one another. And so what I want you to try and wrap yourself around is this idea that this tribal society on the island is a society that when they are not drenched in concupiscence, they are fighting. And when they're not having wars, they're drenched in concupiscence, means having sex all the time with anything and everything. Look, the good Lord created an extremely powerful drive, particularly in men, for the survival of the species. And it's worked pretty well. So don't underestimate its strength. Just because we in the West are able for at least a few hours a day to take our minds off sex and devote it to research or study or work or constructing a building or building a highway. The fact they were able to do that is not inevitable and not natural. It was a huge achievement in the development of the West. And what about fighting? Well, you see, all you got to do is imagine a really persuasive personality arriving on the island. And he's attacked by one tribe, so he runs to the other tribe. And he goes and talks to the other tribe, and he says to them, if you listen to me, I can give you power over the other tribe. You can have a lot of power over them. And they say, oh, really? What's going on? He says, well, but you're going to have to listen to me. And he then pulls out a revolver, and he sees a wild boar running across a clearing, and he draws a bead on it, and he pulls the trigger. There's a loud report, and all the tribal members fall back in horror and shock, and the wild boar drops dead. Well, he's got their attention now. And this persuasive personality says to them, now you're going to have to listen to me. Because if you listen to me, you are going to achieve great success. If you don't listen to me, you are going to be even worse than you are off now as time goes by. They say, all right, fine, what do you want us to do? Okay, here's what I need you to do. I need you to pair off into a thing I'm going to call marriage. Men and women are going to marry one another and be devoted to one another for a lifetime and to the children they raise. Well, it's a tough sell, I don't mind telling you. It's a tough sell. But the persuasive personality manages to keep their attention. And he says, what's more, I got news for you, but within this family, there is no brother-sister funny business. There's no father-daughter stuff. There's no mother-son stuff. Nothing like that is going on. Now, as an aside, I should tell you, and this is just one of the sad realities of where we are now, but the fact that these, what we today would call vices or incest, or we'd speak about these things in very negative terms, rightly, the fact that our diffidence about them is not natural to the human condition, but to the contrary, that humans by nature will proceed to, particularly men, have sex with everything, and they will shatter all of these norms and boundaries within the family that we think of as normal. If you, one of the pieces of evidence that is sad and horrible, but in the categories of pornography that sell so well on the internet are all of these vices and all these perversions. Brother, sister, mother, son, father, daughter. It's all there because it shows that deep within us, we men will in no way be put off or repelled by intimacy with close family members. But along came the persuasive personality to the island, and he says none of that. The thing I'm going to teach you to call a family is going to be a sanctuary and a refuge from rampant sexuality. The daughters are going to be safe. The sons are going to be able to devote time and energy to growing up and becoming acculturated and learning a trade and learning to be useful, because they are going to grow up in an atmosphere in which rampant sexuality doesn't exist. And that's going to allow amazing things to happen. All of a sudden, we're going to have men who are willing to devote a good part of their day and a good part of their week and a good part of their lives to things other than pursuing sex. It's extraordinary. But the persuasive personality makes a point, and he gets them to start doing that. Well, pretty soon, as you can imagine, the fishing success of that tribe begins to really take off. And when you think about it, well, what happens to the agricultural success of that tribe? It's much better than the other tribe, much better, for obvious reasons. And again, if any of this sounds strange to you and hard to believe, it shouldn't. It's very straightforward. It's shocking, it's counterintuitive, it's disturbing, but it shouldn't be hard to see. Because if you take a look at the dark, seamy underbelly, the lowest echelons of society in the United States and in England, and other places as well, but I'm just personally familiar with these two places, what do you find? You find an entire layer of human beings who are non-productive. They're on the dole. The government of England is supporting them. They do nothing. Oh, well, that's not altogether true. They have sex and they fight and indulge in violent crime. You see? When you take away the cultural structures of the West, then men become what men really are deep down inside. Not flattering, but yes, when you probe parts of society, and I'm sure this is true for other countries as well, but as I say, I know America and England, and when you probe the lowest levels of society, they're not working, they're not producing anything, they're receiving money from the government, and what are they doing? They fight, they indulge in violent crime, and they have sex. That's all. And so naturally, very high illegitimate birth rate, all of the problems. They're doing exactly what comes naturally to men. Fighting, taking things from other people when you want them, and finding women, taking women. That's what they do. And so when I tell you about this island in our thought experiment, and I describe what it was like when persuasive personality arrived, it should make perfect sense. That's exactly how it was. But wait, persuasive personality is not finished yet. He sits down with him and he says, now I want to teach you about something called money. This is a way we are going to assign value to an abstract symbol. Might be a dollar, might be a seashell, might be a piece of colored paper or a disc of metal. They all, what's the use of this? I say, well, says the persuasive personality. He says to them, well, look, what you're going to be able to do is use these with the other tribe. They say, with the other tribe? His persuasive personality says, yeah, what do they have you like? Well, they actually have the most wonderful peaches. In their part of the island, there's a whole lot of peach orchards. So what happens when you want peaches? Well, we go and have a war with them. We fight them. And if we lose, we have to run away. And if we win, we take all the peaches we can carry, and sometimes we even burn their peach orchards. Very clever, says persuasive personality. And what happens if a year later you want more peaches? And they shrug and they look at each other and say, well, yeah, it's a bit of a problem. He says, well, with this thing called money, you can have peaches every single day. How does this work? Well, you see, you are already so successful with your fishing, and you've got all kinds of dried fish, more than you can eat, and you've got all kinds of wheat growing and rice growing and vegetables growing. You are going to go to the other tribe and say to them, we want you to accept these metal discs in exchange for your peaches. Now, we know what you're saying. You're thinking, we're not mad. Just bear with us. We will promise you we will accept these metal discs back from you when you want dried fish or when you want rice or when you want wheat. We are so much better than you at growing that stuff. We've got a surplus. We've got more than we need. We'd love you to have it. Now, we could just do a barter where we'd give you that amount and you'd give us the peaches, but that's not so reliable because it's time sensitive. Peaches don't last forever, but the nice thing about money is it's an abstract symbol. It can last forever. And so we want you to get used to this idea. And exactly that's what happens. Now, because the first tribe that persuasive personality came to have been so successful as a result of the fact that they have been channeling sexuality in such a way so as that it doesn't overtake their lives, and they're able to be so productive. They naturally have a lot of things that the other tribe wants. And so the other tribe, when they realize that these little metallic discs can give them access to all the wonderful things that the first tribe has produced, they're very happy and they buy in. This is how it used to be in America during the 19th and 20th centuries. America made the best of everything. Agricultural equipment, machinery, cars, wheat, whatever you wanted you could get from America. Not surprisingly, the dollar became high demand. Because of course you'd want the money that the country that has the most things available. It's like, having the best shopping mall in the world, and you're able to just go in there. You got dollars, it means you can buy anything you want from America. Well, things have changed a little bit. Today, it's actually China makes the things that everybody wants. Well, Germany a little bit still, Korea does. But the fact is that for the moment, those countries are still happy to trade in dollars because the dollars they take, they can still use to some extent. But that's going to be changing. And each and every person, as you try and shape and sculpt your life in accordance with your 5 F's, your 5 channels of activity and development and progress, you've got to bear in mind that the dollar might be losing value in the foreseeable future. That's what's going on. And so on this island, all of a sudden, you've heard the old expression that people who trade don't fight. It's absolutely true. All of a sudden, it makes no sense for these two tribes to continue their warfare with each other, because the arrival of this abstract, brilliant, spiritual idea called money makes it much more profitable for them to trade with each other than to fight each other. Because when you take something away from somebody else, you can only do that once, twice. But if you buy it from them, you're encouraging them to produce more and more of it, and you have a limitless supply of whatever it is you want. That's the beauty of trade. And so persuasive personality eventually impacts both tribes on that island. Well, I'm thinking that most of you happy warriors are already catching on to this metaphor. What happens in about 300? Well, Judaism gives birth to Christianity, and you've now got in Judea, in the Middle East, in the land of Israel, you've got Judaism and you've got Christianity. And you've got the Council of Nicaea about 300, and you've got Constantinople being formed. Today it's called Istanbul because 1,000 years later the Muslims took it over and killed all the Christians who lived there and turned it into a Muslim city. Every glorious cathedral was turned into a mosque. But prior to that time, it was the center of Eastern Christianity. And then Rome became the Roman Empire adopts Christianity. Weird things are happening. And all of a sudden, the Bible, persuasive personality, the Bible shows up and people are attracted. They see what's going on here, that they can really benefit by adopting this. And they look and they see that those who have adopted it are thriving. And then back to our island analogy, the second tribe's not going to be long before they look at the first island and persuasive personalities' impact on that island. And not only do they adopt money, but they're going to start adopting all these other things. And so replacing violence with trade and with compliance, it's a game changer, but it's from the Bible. And it spreads throughout the Roman Empire very quickly. By 700, England is becoming amazingly Christian already. There's a remarkable man called the Venerable Bede who is teaching Bible in about 700. He's the most reliable historian in England of that period. And the Venerable Bede had his abbey. This is one of my many regrets. I've got some, like everybody, I suppose, so many regrets. But one of them was that I was a young student at a rabbinical seminary in the northeast of England for a number of years, And literally within hiking distance are the ruins of the abbey where the Venerable Bede used to teach Bible and teach people Christianity and teach people belief in Almighty God. I could have taken a hike and I could have walked among those ruins. I could have told you now today, hey, I walked in the ruins of the building where the Venerable Bede changed England into just another country of warring tribes, and he turned it in to the land that became the heartbeat of the West, the land that produced the Industrial Revolution, the land that produced civilization. Extraordinary. But that's what happens. Christianity spreads. Around about the same time, meanwhile, the Romans destroyed the temple, they sacked Jerusalem, and its Jews start leaving. The Romans took who knows how many thousands of people away from Jerusalem into Rome in captivity as slaves. You can actually see this depicted on a frieze inside Titus's Arch in Jerusalem. You can see the Romans bringing their trails of slaves from Judea back to Rome. And many came voluntarily. Round about the beginning of the calendar, there were already Jews settled in Ostia Antica, which was the port of Rome. Now there I have been, and there I have walked in the ruins of a synagogue from before the time of Jesus. Jews were already trading with parts of the Roman Empire, but it accelerated, and you've got a big arrival of Jews. Now, let me point out to you that until about the 1600s, we didn't have things called countries. The whole concept of a country is fairly modern. Before that time, the basic institution of municipal and governmental centers was the city-state. So you've heard of Athens, you've heard of Sparta, and very often, right, cities would be at war with one another. It wasn't countries, it was cities. The polis, the Greeks called it polis, the polis. That was the essence. And they weren't like today. Today a big city is 10 million people. Not back then. Back then, a big city might have been 200,000 people. Well, you bring 1,000 Jews or 1,000 Christians into a city like that, and they start teaching Bible, and they start teaching what money is, and they start teaching what trade is. Of course it has an impact. As late as in the 1500s, the city of Hamburg, which was, by the way, part of the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League started in about 1200, and it was an association of city-states, Lubeck and Danzig and Hamburg, and London became part of that, and about 25 cities around the Baltic and around the North Sea constituted the Hanseatic League. Hansa in German means an association, like Lufthansa. Luft means air in Germany, like Luftwaffe, the air force of the Nazis. Luft is air, and Hansa is an association, because in the early days of German aviation, there was a whole bunch of tiny little airlines that were starting up. And so they were all brought together as an association of airlines, Lufthansa. Hanseatic League was an association of cities that took care of one another and set up trading protocols with one another. Well, the more two people trade, the richer they each get. And so Hanseatic League cities did very, very well. And Hamburg sent a message to Amsterdam. What happened is the Spanish finally took back the peninsula from the Muslims towards the end of the 15th century, and they kicked out all the Muslims and they kicked out all the Jews. And many of the Jews went to Holland and prospered and did very, very well indeed. Economically, Spain began its decline, because when you kick the Jews out, it's usually a disaster. It doesn't work well. William the Conqueror, in I think about 1100, brought Jews to England. Why? Because he knew that he needed capital. In order to build the government that he foresaw, he needed capital. And if you want capital, you need biblical principles. And so he brought the Jews. There were certain ways in which Jews were more effective than Catholics before that, having to do with the laws of interest, which Catholics interpreted a little bit differently from Jews in the Bible. So Jews were able to lend capital, whereas Catholics were not. And so William the Conqueror brought Jews to England, and there they survived and did very well and was wonderful for England until 1259, where was it King Richard, I think, evicted all the Jews for reasons I've told you about another time. And not surprisingly, England went into economic decline until Oliver Cromwell, another religious Christian, in about 1660, brought the Jews back to England. And not surprisingly, the Industrial Revolution took place 100 years later. You know why? Because the capital was there. The Jews had 100 years to start setting up systems of finance that would make it possible for railways to be built, for machineries and factories to be built. So 1750, the Industrial Revolution goes crazy. I was telling you about the Jews in Amsterdam. Hamburg sends messengers to Amsterdam in the 1500s saying, we want to strengthen the economy of Hamburg. Can you find 10 or 20 Jewish families who'd be willing to come and settle in Hamburg? That was how people thought, because cities were small. It didn't take a lot of people to change the culture of the city. And sure enough, you can find in both Jewish historical records and German historical records, sure enough, they brought a bunch of families from Holland to Hamburg, and they established themselves there. And you can still, to this day, in a suburb of Hamburg called Altona, you can actually find the old Jewish cemetery from these original families that were brought from Holland to help build up the economy of Hamburg, which they really did very effectively. So there you've got the picture. Basically, what built Western civilization is the arrival of the Bible. And I hope you see this as a worthy 500th show, because this is a vast landscape that I'm depicting for you. But I'm sure you got it. You're a happy warrior, I know that, and I have confidence in you, and I want you to understand this. Because when you understand that the Bible makes it possible for people to replace violence and fighting with trade, and you begin to understand how like-minded people can form a Hansa, they can form a confederation, and you realize how your financial well-being and your ability to earn a living would be dramatically enhanced, provided you can increase your circle of association. Hello, we're getting somewhere. Right? Making a living is hard, but it doesn't have to be. If you know the principles that the Jews and the Christians brought to Europe, which is what changed the West from the rest. That's something that we can all learn from, and we can all do and take care of. And I think it helps us also understand that, I just want to see if I noted anything else I wanted to be sure to tell you about. Okay, well, I mean, there's a lot more details, but I don't want to make this show any longer than it necessarily has to be. But what you do see now is why the forces of progressivism, wokeism, why do they hate Western civilization? Because their hatred is against the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their hatred translates to the civilization that was produced by the biblical blueprint of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They hate capitalism. Well, of course, because capitalism is at the heart of civilization. It's a system where we assign value to abstract ideas like money. Extraordinary. The corporation. A straightforward biblical concept. It's totally spiritual. Got to see that. Right? And so, understandably, it's not surprising that the forces of wokeism have allied with the forces of radical Islam, because they both hate the West. They both, at root, hate Judaism and Christianity, and they hate the civilization that it has built. I hope I've given you something to think about. There's a great deal here. I've obviously had to condense what is, if I told you everything on this, I would essentially be giving you about, I'd say about, probably about 6 or 7 hours is what I would have to speak about. But I've given you more than enough for you to catch the picture and fill in the rest yourself through your own reading and even just through your own thinking, because it's all pretty logical when you realize what would life be like if the Torah had never been given on Mount Sinai. Had that never happened, no Judaism, no Christianity, no Western civilization. That's really what it was like. And when Christianity arrived on the wider scene, it was shocking to people, this notion that there should be sexual restraint. Really? That's true. And as a matter of fact, ancient Jewish wisdom points out the words in Scripture that indicate the unhappiness of the Israelites upon being given the Torah, because it violated their whole sense of sexual freedom and adventure. There was no limit. Anyone and everyone was fair game. And along comes the Torah with comprehensive lists in Leviticus, given not once but twice, of the intimacy liaisons which are from now on prohibited. A shock, but it changed everything. It made civilization possible, because people who are obsessed with sex and violence and crime are not producing anything, least of all a civilization. And so the first thing was to place a system of restraints upon human passions, and then the spiritual wonder of civilization can emerge. And it becomes possible to live a life where maybe you do only work I work 6 days a week by choice. And I think it's wonderful, because I get 1 day a week where I literally do not think about work at all. I turn off my phone, I turn off my computer. It's wonderful. But I can only do that because of this thing called civilization. And I can only travel distances in time that my great-grandparents could only have dreamed of in futility, because I have cars and I have access to airplanes. But all of that is only because of Western civilization. And Western civilization is only there because of the Bible that was dispersed by Judaism first, and then even much more effectively by Christianity. So bear in mind these things. Yes, it is hard to make a living, but it doesn't have to be, because the world did not have to remain in the state of tribal warfare and hopelessness and despair that was the lot of so much of Asia and Europe and Africa and South America as recently as the beginning of the 20th century. And everywhere that has succeeded since then has succeeded by the adoption of these principles. 200 million Christians in China. You don't think that has an effect? A very large portion of the population of South Korea, perhaps 60%, seriously Christian. You don't think that has an effect? You don't think the fact that Nevada and Utah, although similar in many demographic ways, are incomparable in the terms of quality of life and economic development? Why do you think Utah does so much better than Nevada? Come on. It's because of religion. It's a Bible-based religion. So yeah, the LDS Church is highly influential. Look what a difference it makes. So, my dear happy warriors, visit the website, RabbiDanielLapin.com. Become a happy warrior. Make sure you have a copy of the defining roadmap of your life the holistic you. And we'll be together, God willing, in another week. And in the interim, it's onwards and upwards with all of our 5Fs, focusing on our families and our finances, our friendships, our fitness, and our faith. God bless.